There are places in the Imperium where the sky never changes, where the sun is a distant rumor whispered by the old and the dying. In these places, people do not live, they endure. They rise before the klaxons scream, shuffle through miles of rusted corridors, and offer their strength to titanic machines that will never remember their names. Hunger gnaws at their bones, hope fades into a dull ache, and obedience becomes a kind of survival instinct. For countless civilians across 1,000,000 worlds, this is not misfortune or tragedy, it is life. It is normal, it is the quiet suffering upon which an empire stands. And if this truth unsettles you, then stay with it and with us. Support this story by liking, sharing, and helping it reach those who still believe the Imperium shelters its own. The day always began before I was ready for it, because here, beneath the planet's poisoned sky, dawn wasn't something that rose, it was something that screamed. The klaxons tore through the hab block walls like serrated metal, vibrating through the cot frames, rattling the rusted water pipes that hadn't run clean in decades, and shaking the thin air from my lungs. There was no silence in this place, no gentle transition from sleep to consciousness. There was only the abrupt command to rise, to move, to take your place in the grand machinery of survival. And so, like everyone else who still had the strength to obey, I forced my eyes open and joined the slow, shuffling tide toward the corridor. The smell struck first, that blend of sweat, old metal, decaying insulation, and stale ration powder that clung to every surface. It wasn't foul anymore, not in the way a new recruit might retch at it, but worn in, familiar, like a scar that had stopped hurting but never truly healed. People passed shoulder to shoulder in the narrow corridor, each one wrapped in the same dull expression, the same hunched posture. Most never looked up. The ceiling hung low, a lattice of exposed wiring and cracked metal plates, dripping condensation that tasted faintly of copper when it landed on your lips. Some said the moisture was a blessing from the Emperor, a reminder that even forgotten worlds received his grace. Others whispered it was runoff from the vent systems failing again. Truth didn't matter. Faith was easier to swallow when it didn't require inspection. My boots struck the floor in the rhythmic thud I had learned to mimic long ago. Steady, efficient, anonymous. The administratum taught us that uniformity was safety, and in a world like ours, safety was a precious illusion. I clutched my dented data slate to my chest, the edges worn smooth from years of use. It wasn't a prized possession so much as a necessity, a token proving I had work assigned to my name and wasn't one of the labor shadows, the drifting jobless who lingered in corners until the enforcers dragged them away. No one ever saw them again. Some claimed they were transferred to distant manufactorums. Others feared they became fresh components for new servitors. We learned not to ask. As we funneled down the hab block stairs, the vibration of heavy machinery thrummed up from the depths below, a pulse that radiated through the walls like a heartbeat too large for any living thing. The entire complex felt alive, but not in a comforting way. It felt like an old beast, half asleep, fed by our sweat and sacrifice, its rumbling belly the reactors that powered the district. And if it ever woke fully, its hunger would devour us without hesitation. The lift banks were already full, their cage doors slamming shut as overloaded platforms groaned downward. People pressed forward anyway, desperate to catch a ride instead of walking the kilometer-long descent. I didn't bother. I had learned long ago that trying to wedge myself into the crush only meant bruised ribs, or worse, being the unfortunate soul shoved too close to the edge as the lift dropped. Instead, I took the side. Stairwell, worn smooth from generations of foot traffic, spiraling downward in an endless dim. Each step hummed with the generational fatigue of the countless dead who had walked it before me. Halfway down, I slowed, not because I was tired, but because I could hear the distant chanting drifting through the ventilation grates, the morning hymns. Somewhere above, a cluster of robed attendants recited litanies before a corroded shrine, attempting to coax functioning from ancient machinery. Their voices rose and fell with mechanical cadence, praise, supplication, praise again. The words merged with the drone of turbines, becoming part of the background rhythm of our days. When I finally reached the lower concourse, light flared in harsh flashes from the overhead lumen strips. Some flickered as though struggling to remain alive. Shadows stuttered across the corridor, distorting the shapes of passing workers. A woman carrying a bundle of tools looked like a ghost for a moment, then merely a tired human again. A child in oversized boots followed her, his face marked with oils and dust, already learning the trade that would consume his life before he even understood it. No schools here, no tutors or libraries or lessons on anything beyond the function of machinery and adherence to routine. In the Imperium, the average child's education was simple: work or die. The crowd funneled through the concourse until it split toward the various manufactorums. Mine was Sector Forge Delta 9, a sprawling labyrinth of conveyors, furnaces, and assembly lines that manufactured shell casings for the Astra Militarum, or so the overseers said. We never saw the final product, only our portion of the process, and even that was a narrow slice. The Imperium didn't pay us to understand, only to perform. As I entered the enormous gate, heat slammed into me, the kind of heat that seared the lining of your throat and filled your lungs with metallic dust. The roar of machinery swallowed all other sound, forcing us to communicate through gestures or short, shouted words. Above the vibrating walkways, massive production arms swung with inhuman precision, their joints hissing steam, their plates smeared with decades of grime. Glowing warning sigils marked their danger range, but the machines didn't care if someone stumbled into their reach. They would move regardless. Some workers had lost limbs, a few had lost their lives. In the Imperium, death by machinery wasn't tragedy, it was expected. My assigned position lay half a kilometer into the forge's left flank. I made my way through the chaos, passing the servo lifts, carrying crates of munitions components, the long lines of workers feeding raw materials into the pressing chambers, and the older men and women who sat beside the walls, coughing into ragged cloths stained with black flecks. The forge dust slowly ate the lungs. It was simply a matter of when. I reached my station, a narrow metal platform raised slightly. Above the assembly line, the air shimmered with heat from the furnaces below. My job was monotonous. Inspect casing after casing, confirm alignment, adjust tolerances when the machinery drifted, log the changes, repeat endlessly. Hours blurred when you did this, days blurred. Eventually, your sense of identity blurred too, worn down by routine until you felt less like a person and more like an extension of the machine you served. But today, as I stepped up to my console, something felt wrong. A tremor ran through the platform, sharper than the usual vibration of the belts. I glanced toward the central furnace chamber, where molten promethium-powered fires cast a dull orange glow. The glow flickered, not in the sputtering way of a mechanical hiccup, but like a heartbeat faltering. The workers around me paused, not out of shock, because shock was a luxury we rarely indulged in, but out of instinct. You didn't want to be mid-task when the forge misbehaved. It had a way of punishing those who didn't show it respect. A moment later, the overhead Vox grill crackled. A voice barked out, orders sharp, clipped, impatient. The overseers were resetting the furnace cycle. Nothing unusual, they claimed, just a momentary disruption. Resume work. The moment passed. Everyone returned to their tasks, though unease lingered like a thin, acrid taste on the tongue. For the next few hours, I worked in silence. The lines clattered, the machinery sang its grinding chorus, and sweat dripped from my brow onto the console screen. Time meant nothing here. The only markers were the tremors of the machinery shifting cycles and the brief, sanctioned breaks where we filed to the nutrient dispensers for our allotted ration of flavorless paste. During one such break, I leaned against a pillar of reinforced steel, spooning the paste into my mouth with mechanical rhythm. Across from me, a man named Helvan sat hunched over his own ration. We weren't friends few had the energy for friendship, but we knew each other's faces, each other's work patterns. That was enough. He looked worse than usual today. His eyes were sunken, the skin around them bruised with purple shadows. His hands trembled between bites. "You hear anything about last night?" he asked suddenly, voice low. I frowned. "What about last night?" He swallowed slowly, as if the words weighed too much. "Enforcers were out. Dragged 3 from Block 12. Said they were hoarding. said their ration chips didn't match the records. I paused mid-bite. Hoarding was a dangerous accusation, often fabricated. And? I asked. And they didn't come back. Neither of us spoke for a moment. The forge's hum filled the silence, vibrating through the metal under our feet. Then, quieter still, Helvan added, "People say the shortages are getting worse, that shipments are delayed. Something's wrong. Rumor, dangerous rumor. In the Imperium, rumors spread faster than plague, and sometimes killed quicker." "We keep working," I said, not because I believed it solved anything, but because it was the only answer we were allowed to have. Helvan nodded and returned to his paste, but his eyes didn't leave the floor. By the end of the shift, my muscles ached, my throat felt raw, and my thoughts drifted like ash. As I stepped out of the manufactorum into the cooling air of the lower concourse, I felt that same strange tension I'd sensed earlier, something unseen, something shifting. The sky above the smokestacks was dim, choked with soot and clouds. The world felt heavier, as though pressing down on us. Civilians streamed around me, silent, defeated, faces gaunt with exhaustion. We moved together but alone, bound by duty yet isolated in our suffering. And for the first time in years, I wondered if the weight crushing us wasn't just the burden of work, or hunger, or routine, but the quiet warning of a world beginning to crumble. Night in the lower districts was never truly dark. The glow from the manufactorum stacks painted the sky in a perpetual haze of rust orange and sickly green, reflected by the drifting pollution that floated like drowned memories in the air. Even the shadows had weight here, thick as the soot that clung beneath your fingernails. When I left the forge and returned to the hab block, the corridor lights flickered with their usual dying rhythm, buzzing like flies trapped behind thin glass. The air tasted of burnt metal, always burnt metal. I told myself it was normal, that I had known nothing else, though a faint whisper of a childhood memory, fresh air, rain, something clean haunted the back of my mind like a lie I wished I could believe. Helvan walked beside me for a time, but neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The silence between workers was familiar, almost comforting. Words were wasted when exhaustion already scraped every last thought thin. The stairwell echoed with distant arguments, someone cursing their malfunctioning heater unit, another pleading that their water allocation was miscounted, a third insisting to an uninterested attendant that their cough had worsened and they needed medical attention. Medical attention. The phrase itself was almost comical here, where the Medicae stations were overburdened relics, staffed by undertrained apprentices, and groaning servitors powered by will alone. Helvan peeled off toward his dormitory, the faded number stenciled above the door glowing faintly in the gloom. I continued onward, past doors marked with peeling paint and rusted Aquila motifs, each one indistinguishable from the next. When I reached my own bunk room, the door's lock flickered a moment before granting entry. Inside, the space was exactly as I had left it, narrow, cold, utilitarian, a metal cot, a cracked wash basin, a small shrine to the Emperor built from spare casing fragments, its prayer script worn by my fingerprints, necessity, faith, and despair in equal measure. I sat on the cot and rubbed my hands together, trying to chase the chill from my bones. Then I froze. Something outside was wrong. Normally, the corridor carried a constant murmur from hundreds of civilians going about their routines, even late into the night. But now, the air was unnervingly still. A hush hung outside, as if the entire block had stopped breathing. The silence didn't feel peaceful, it felt anticipatory, like the world was waiting for something to break. A heavy thud sounded in the hallway, then another, footsteps deliberate, armored, unhurried. I stood, heart thudding in my chest. Enforcers patrolled often, but their boots usually came in clusters, a chorus of stomping ahead of raids or ration audits. This was a single individual, moving slowly, a presence dragging dread behind it like a chain. The footsteps stopped outside my door, my lungs seized. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Then, as suddenly as they had come, they continued down the hallway, fading into the distance. Only when the sound was fully gone did I let out a broken exhale. The tension in my shoulders dissolved into shaking hands. I sat back down and tried to steady my breathing. But sleep did not come easily. When it did arrive, it carried dreams that felt like memories pressed through a cracked lens, a burning sky, screams drowned by machinery, a towering figure with too many limbs, a shadow falling over the city. When the klaxons jolted me awake for the next shift, I almost felt grateful. The morning crowd moved slower than usual, uncertainty weighing on everyone. People whispered in close pockets, eyes darting toward corners as though expecting someone or something to emerge. I followed the stream down the stairs, gripping my data slate tightly. The air felt colder, rawer, as if a pressure system had shifted and left our lungs scrambling to adjust. In the lower concourse, the administratum bulletin screens flickered. There, messages usually displayed work quotas or censures against those who failed to meet expectations. But today, the text scrolled in jagged, corrupted lines, the words barely readable. A few workers paused to squint at the screens, but most hurried past. You didn't linger near malfunctioning systems. The enforcers always assumed sabotage. I found myself stopping, staring. The message repeated across the screens: supply route delays, expect temporary disruptions, maintain productivity, Emperor protects. Nothing unusual on its surface. Imperium logistics were always delayed, always strained, always on the verge of collapse. But something about the slurred font, the grainy distortions, suggested that the message wasn't merely corrupted. It was rushed, panicked, as though someone was trying to reassure a populace they didn't know how to comfort. A hand gripped my shoulder. I flinched, turning sharply. It was Helvan, breathing heavily as if he had run to catch up. "You saw the screens?" he asked. I nodded slowly. "Supply issues." He leaned closer, his voice barely a whisper. "It's worse than that. I heard a foreman muttering during night rotation. Said the upper habs are rationing water more aggressively, and they've increased patrols near the transit rails." My gut twisted. Transit rails? "Why?" Helvan swallowed. "They're saying the trains haven't come through. Not in 3 days." I stared at him. The trains were the lifeline of the district, bringing food, raw materials, repair crews, everything that kept this dying world from collapsing entirely. Without them, we would be stranded. As though sensing my thoughts, Helvan added softly, "We can't tell anyone else. Panic will spread." But I needed someone to know in case. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. We parted ways at the manufactorum gate. The furnaces roared hotter today, as if trying to compensate for some unseen failing. The air shimmered with heat, and the machines groaned like beasts under strain. My station felt familiar, yet foreign, as though the world had subtly shifted and left everything slightly misaligned. I began my work, hands guiding casing after casing through the inspection apparatus. The rhythm usually lulled my mind into numb obedience, but today, every movement felt wrong, too deliberate, too conscious. My gaze flicked often toward the furnace chamber. Its flames jumped unpredictably, casting warped shadows across the walls. Workers nearby muttered to themselves, their gestures sharper than usual, their nerves frayed. Halfway through the shift, the machinery stuttered. A grinding shriek filled the forge, and the assembly line jerked violently. Several workers stumbled. Sparks rained from an overhead servo arm. The Vox grill crackled with frantic static as overseers argued, their voices overlapping in desperate attempts to regain control. Then the furnace lights dimmed, and the entire forge plunged into momentary darkness. A silence followed, brief, suffocating, absolute. Then the alarms detonated. Red lumen strips flashed. Emergency klaxons bellowed. Workers screamed as the machines bucked, releasing mechanical limbs that swung without calibration. The smell of burning oil filled the air, thick and choking. Somewhere to my right, someone fell into the conveyor, their cry cut short by a sickening crunch. I clung to my console, heart hammering. The ground trembled as the backup power surged, restoring partial illumination. Overseers shouted from their gantries, waving us back into formation, insisting the disruption was contained. But nothing felt contained. The forge shook, with a deep vibration that didn't belong to machinery at all. Helvan appeared beside me, panting, his eyes wide. "Did you feel that?" I nodded. The whole sector felt that. Before either of us could say more, an explosion rocked the far wall. Fire erupted from a fuel line, flaring into a column of heat that hurled metal shards across the platform. Workers scattered. Some leapt over railings to avoid the blast, others were too slow. My ears rang from the shock. The world blurred. Shapes moved in frantic patterns, and the stench of burning flesh and molten steel filled my lungs. Overseers fought to regain control, but the forge was too far gone. The machinery groaned like a dying titan, the assembly lines twisting as their supports melted. "Move!" Helvan shouted, grabbing my arm. We pushed toward the exit corridors, following a stream of terrified workers. The emergency shutters were falling too quickly, sealing off sections of the forge to contain the fire. One slammed down just meters behind us, the impact sending a wave of heat across my back. We ran through choking smoke until we reached the concourse outside. The moment we emerged, the sight stole the breath from my lungs. Crowds were already gathering. Civilians swarmed the stairwells, their voices rising in panic. Enforcers attempted to push them back, but even they looked shaken. The manufactorum alarms echoed through the district, bouncing off the walls like the wails of dying spirits. "Sector Gamma is reporting failures too," someone shouted. "It's not just Delta 9. A woman clutched her child, sobbing into his hair. A man ranted that the Emperor was testing them, that only the faithful would survive. Another claimed it was sabotage, that rebels were punishing the district for its loyalty. Rumors spiraled, each more frantic than the last. But beneath all of it, one truth pulsed like a vein ready to burst. Something was happening, something big, something that could no longer be contained. As the forge continued to burn behind us, its flames staining the sky with ash, I felt the world tilt under my feet. The cracks in our lives were widening, and whatever had caused them was still coming. The days that followed felt stretched thin, as though time itself had been pulled taut until even the smallest moment trembled with the threat of tearing open. The manufactorum fire had been contained, or so the overseers claimed, but the stink of smoke still clung to the district like a bruise that refused to fade. Repairs were promised, stability was promised, but promises meant nothing in a place where the walls themselves whispered how little the Imperium valued the lives trapped behind them. We all returned to our shifts because there was nowhere else to go, but the forge's heartbeat was wrong, now uneven, skipping beats like a dying organ too stubborn to stop. I noticed the first true sign of unraveling the moment I stepped through the gate on the third morning after the fire. The assembly lines were moving, but they stuttered visibly, the rhythm broken by irregular pauses. Servitors shambled awkwardly, their limbs twitching with misfiring commands. The overseers barked, orders with voices strained and thin, their data slates clutched tight enough to whiten knuckles. Even the air tasted different, colder, almost metallic, as though some unseen hand had pressed the world into a tighter mold. Helvan joined me quietly at our station. For the first time since I'd known him, he didn't attempt a greeting. "You hear anything new?" I asked, keeping my voice barely audible beneath the grind of machinery. He nodded once. "Transit rails still dead. No trains, no shipments. They've blocked access to the upper concourse enforcers standing guard in full kit." My fingers tightened around the casing I held. "They're hiding something. They're afraid," he whispered. "That scares me more." We worked in silence for a while, though neither of us truly focused on the task. The assembly line jerked with increasing violence, occasionally lurching so suddenly that workers pulled their hands away in fear of losing fingers. Someone yelled when a servo arm dropped a component, shattering it across the great floor. Nearby, a servitor convulsed, its mechanical limbs locking in rigid paralysis as sparks spat from its skull plate. Down the line, an overseer shouted into his vox, trying to coordinate repairs, but the static-laced response made his expression hollow. A sense of dread seeped into my bones, heavy and certain. The forge wasn't failing, it was disintegrating, piece by piece, as if some foundational truth had shifted beneath it. Halfway through the shift, the main alarm blared again, but this time it wasn't fire. It was ration emergency. The sound punched through the forge, sharper and more desperate than the typical warnings. Workers froze mid-motion. Overseers paled. The klaxon echoed through the manufactorum with a kind of breathless urgency, its pitch rising and falling like a creature crying out. Helvan straightened. Not again. The Vox grills crackled to life, and a stern voice filled the chamber. Attention Sector Delta 9. Due to supply interruptions, water and nutrient rations will be redistributed according to emergency schedule Gamma 13. Return to your hab blocks for allocation. Maintain order. Maintain compliance. Emperor protects. The line went dead. For a single heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the panic broke. Workers surged toward the exits, pushing and shouting. Overseers tried to hold them back, but they were swept aside. Even the servitors, confused by lost signal feeds, shambled unpredictably, blocking corridors and creating bottlenecks. The manufactorum became a storm of desperation. People fought to reach the doorways before the shutters locked again, hoping to retrieve something, anything that would help them survive the coming scarcity. Helvan grabbed my wrist. Move! We pushed forward with the crowd, dodging flailing limbs and collapsing machinery. The emergency shutters began descending, their groaning metal echoing through the forge. Like grinding teeth, a man ahead tripped. 2 others ran over him without hesitation. I forced myself not to look. We slipped through one of the narrowing gaps seconds before the shutter slammed closed behind us, sealing away the roar of the manufactory and leaving only the harsh intake of our own breath. The concourse was chaos. Hundreds flooded down the ramps toward the ration distribution center. Enforcers shouted commands, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. The smell of fear was overpowering, sweat, grime, and the metallic tang of panic. People shouted accusations, prayers, threats. Families clustered together. Some carried containers stolen from maintenance rooms, hoping to fill them before supplies ran dry. We reached the outer edge of the crowd, but the mass ahead was impassable. Bodies pressed together so tightly they formed a single undulating wall. "This is madness," I said, breathless. "No," Helvan replied, voice shaking. "This is hunger." The enforcers formed a barricade before the ration doors. Their shock batons crackled, and their visors reflected the frenzied masses pressing against them. When someone tried to break through, the enforcers struck without hesitation. Bodies fell. Others pushed over them in desperation. I felt something cold settle inside me. This was not a temporary emergency. This was the first crack in a dam that held back something far worse. Helvan tugged my sleeve. "We won't make it through here. We need another route. We don't have authorization." His expression hardened. "Do you care?" We slipped away from the collapsing ration line and ducked into a maintenance corridor. It was dimly lit, the lumen strips flickering with the same erratic pulse that had infected everything lately. The scent of coolant leaks and lubricant oil hung thick. Pipes lined the walls like tangled veins, sweating condensation that dripped steadily onto the grated floor. We made our way toward the auxiliary storage bay, a stretch of rooms usually reserved for tools and scrap materials. Most civilians didn't know of them, and those who did avoided them for fear of reprimand. But rules meant nothing in a world where survival itself was becoming a form of rebellion. When we reached the bay, we found it unlocked. That alone chilled me. Inside, scattered crates lay toppled. The shelves were half empty, their contents hastily torn away. Footprints marked the dust on the floor, multiple pairs, some small, some heavy, a trail leading deeper into the gloom. Helvan raised his hand, signaling caution. We moved quietly between shelving units, our footsteps muffled by layers of grime. Then we heard it, a muffled sob. We rounded a corner to find a woman kneeling beside a small ration container. She was young, but exhaustion had carved harsh lines into her face. In her arms, a child no older than 5 clung to her, crying weakly. The container in front of them was empty, completely empty. The woman snapped, her head toward us, eyes wide with terror. "Please, please, we found nothing. We're not thieves. We're just..." Her voice cracked. "We're just hungry." Helvan knelt, slowly, hands raised. "We're not here to turn you in." She stared, untrusting, until the truth in his voice broke through her panic. She sagged, sobbing quietly as her child buried his face against her shoulder. I swallowed hard. "There has to be something left." "There isn't," she whispered. "They cleared this place out last night. Someone knew the rations were going to fail. Someone took everything they could." The implications hit with brutal clarity. Someone with authority. Someone who had known before any announcements. Someone preparing for something far bigger. Before we could respond, a distant boom reverberated through the corridor. The lights flickered violently. Dust rained from the ceiling. Then the alarms blared again, this time with a pitch none of us had ever heard. High, sharp, urgent, evacuation alarm. The woman's eyes widened. What now? Helvan grabbed my arm. Sector breach. My blood ran cold. From where? But the answer came before he could form it. The Vox speakers crackled with frantic distortion. All personnel evacuate, unknown threat. Multiple districts compromised. Repeat, this is not a drill. The speakers died with a burst of static. We stared at one another, breathless. Whatever had been happening beneath the surface was no longer content to hide in the cracks. It had broken through, and it was coming for all of us. The evacuation alarm continued to wail across the sector, its shrill cry echoing through the ventilation shafts and metal corridors until it seemed to vibrate within my bones. No one in Delta 9 had ever lived through a true evacuation scenario. Drills, yes, forced marches through smoke-filled hallways while overseers took notes on their data slates, but never the real thing. And the moment the alarm changed pitch, everyone felt it in the gut. This was not a test, not some bureaucratic performance meant to demonstrate compliance. Something had gone wrong far beyond the boundaries of our district, and whatever it was had shaken the administratum enough to break their usual silence. Helvan urged the young mother and her child toward a side passage. Stay close, don't fall behind. His voice carried no authority, yet both obeyed him as though instinct chose for them. Maybe desperation made everyone listen to the first calm voice they heard. Lights flickered overhead as we moved. The corridor shuddered again, a low metallic groan that rippled through the structure like the moan of something ancient and wounded. Loose dust drifted down like gray snow, settling in hair and clothing. The child whimpered. The mother hushed him, though her own breathing trembled as she clutched him tighter. We passed through a series of junctions normally sealed during standard operation, but every bulkhead stood wide open. The sector's automated lockdown protocols had clearly failed, or been disabled. I wasn't sure which answer frightened me more. What do you think happened? I whispered to Helvan once. The mother and her son were far enough ahead. He shook his head. Could be a substructural collapse. Could be a breach in the outer wall. Could be... His voice faltered. Could be something else. Something else. In the Imperium. Covered possibilities ranging from catastrophic reactor failures to invasive biohazards to the horrors none dared name aloud. Things that lived beyond void or reason. Things the preachers warned of in sermons meant more to frighten than to enlighten. We did not have long to speculate. We turned a corner and immediately froze. The corridor beyond was lit in a sickly red glow, emergency lumens painting the metal in waves of warning color. At its far end, a squad of enforcers stood firm, shock mauls raised, forming a blockade across the passage. Civilians pressed against them in panicked clusters, pleading, shouting, begging for explanation or escape. The enforcers gave none. Their black visors revealed nothing, only blank reflections of the crowd. One of them lifted his Vox amplifier. All civilians return to your designated HAB block shelters. The transit stairwells are closed. Follow reroute protocols now. Repeat, follow reroute protocols. No one moved. No one believed them. Someone in the back shouted, "Shelters are full. They locked us out." Another voice rose, "My family is up there. Let us through." The enforcers raised their weapons. The message was clear. Keep pressing, and bodies would fall. Helvan leaned close to me. We can't go that way, but that path leads to the central lifts. If they're blocking it, then they're hiding something. The mother looked between us anxiously. Where do we go? Helvan pointed down a narrow maintenance shaft, branching off from the main corridor. That way. It's cramped, but it'll bypass their line. We slipped into the passage just as an enraged civilian threw something, maybe a wrench, at the enforcer blockade. The resulting crack of a shock maul slamming into flesh echoed after us like a brutal punctuation mark. Inside the shaft, the air felt close and stale. Pipes hissed with steam. Condensation dripped onto our shoulders, cold against our overheated skin. The shaft twisted sharply before opening into another corridor, this one quieter, though no less tense. We paused to catch our breath. The mother rocked her child gently, her hand trembling as she stroked his hair. "Why are they doing this?" she whispered, not expecting an answer. Helvan didn't try to give one, but he didn't need to. I felt it too, the looming sense that the enforcers weren't simply maintaining order. They were containing something. Whether fear or infection or knowledge, they were holding back an invisible tide. We continued on. The deeper we traveled into the auxiliary corridors, the more signs of disruption we found. A burst pipe flooding the floor with scalding vapor, automated doors stuck open or shut at irregular intervals, discarded tools, data slates, and even clothing strewn about as though people had fled mid-task. The silence became oppressive, broken only by distant alarms and the occasional thundering vibration from far below. Eventually, we reached a security checkpoint, normally manned by 2 officers. The booth sat empty, its terminal flickering with corrupted displays. The smell of burnt circuitry clung to the air. "What happened here?" I murmured. Helvan stepped closer to the booth. "Terminal overload. Someone forced a manual override. But why empty the station afterward?" A thought slipped unbidden into my mind. Because they were needed somewhere worse. The checkpoint led into the administrative quadrant, a region of the sector few workers ever saw. This was where local administratum scribes recorded production quotas, processed compliance reports, and transmitted data to higher authorities. The walls were cleaner here, the lights brighter, the floor less worn. Even the air smelled different, filtered through higher-grade purifiers. But tonight, the scent of decay mingled with that filtered sterility. We advanced slowly, every breath taut with expectation. Halfway down the main corridor, we found the first body. A scribe lay slumped against a wall, his robes stained dark at the chest. His eyes stared upward, glassy and hollow. A data slate rested on the floor beside his limp hand, its cracked screen still glowing faintly. The mother covered her child's face, turning him away. Helvan knelt beside the corpse, studying the wound. Blunt force, not a shock maul, something heavier. "Another civilian?" I asked. "Maybe." His voice carried doubt. "But why strike a scribe?" I glanced around the corridor. The doors to several offices stood ajar, lights flickering inside. Papers littered the floor in disordered heaps, as though someone had rifled through everything with frantic purpose. Something terrible had happened here. We pressed on until we reached the central records chamber. The door was half open, its locking mechanism shattered. Inside, terminals sparked. Shelves had been overturned. Scrolls and data cores lay scattered like debris after an explosion. And in the center of the chaos stood a single enforcer, alone, helmet off, pale, exhausted, trembling. He didn't see us at first. His gaze was fixed on the broken terminals, his breathing ragged. When he finally noticed movement in the doorway, he spun toward us with a start, reaching instinctively for the shock maul at his belt. Helvan immediately raised his hands. "We're not here to fight." The enforcer blinked rapidly, struggling to focus. Sweat dripped down his temples. His eyes were red, not with fury, no, with fear. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped. "No one told us where else to go," I replied carefully. He looked between us, the child, the mother, Helvan, me, and some faint humanity flickered in his expression. "You need to leave the quadrant. Now. This place. It's compromised." "What does that mean?" Helvan asked. The enforcer swallowed hard. "Unauthorized access. Data breaches across half the terminals. Missing personnel. And," his voice faltered, "something moving in the ventworks. Something large. Cold washed over my spine." "Xenos?" "I don't know," he whispered. "I don't know what I saw. Shadows where shadows shouldn't be. Noise without footsteps. People vanishing between one heartbeat and the next." His hand tightened on the maul. "Command won't say a word except to hold the lines and wait for higher authorities." "Higher authorities?" Helvan echoed. The enforcer's face twisted. "Adeptus Arbites. Maybe even an inquisitorial agent passing through the system. They sent coded orders, said they'll handle the anomaly." A silence hung heavy. No civilian ever wanted to hear the word anomaly. It was a promise that no explanation would ever be given, only consequences. "We can't go back," I said. "You can't stay here," the enforcer insisted. Get to the lower levels. If the Arbites cleanse the sector, they'll start with the administrative blocks. The mother's breath hitched. Cleanse? What does cleanse mean? The enforcer didn't answer. He didn't need to. We all understood. Helvan stepped forward. Which route is safest? The enforcer pointed toward a maintenance hatch behind one of the toppled shelves. Down that shaft, follow the magnetic rails. They'll lead you toward the recycling districts. And you? I asked. His gaze drifted to the ruined terminals. I have orders. Orders. Even as his hands shook, even as fear shone raw in his eyes, we left him there. I don't know if he survived the long night that followed. Part of me hopes he didn't suffer. We descended into the maintenance shaft, the walls tight around us, the air warming with the heat rising from machinery below. Every distant vibration felt sharper, more violent. The child began to cry softly, his small voice echoing in the metal throat of the shaft. As we crawled deeper, the sector above us groaned an immense, structural shudder. Something was happening up there, something far beyond our sight. A purge, a collapse, or perhaps the first quiet movements of whatever had triggered the alarm in the first place. The Imperium's great hand was moving, and we were trapped beneath its shadow. The maintenance shaft seemed to stretch on forever, a narrow throat of rusted metal and sweating pipes that swallowed us whole. Our descent felt less like escape and more like sinking slowly, inevitably into a darkness that had always been waiting. The alarms above continued to wail in distant, muffled pulses, each one fainter than the last, as we put more and more steel between ourselves and the administrative quadrant. Yet even muted, they carried a weight that pressed on the chest. Something irreversible had begun, and the sector was groaning under its strain like a wounded colossus. Helvan led, his hands steady as he guided us along the magnetic support rails running down the center of the shaft. I followed close behind, the mother clutching her child just behind me, her movements jerky with fatigue. The metal rungs beneath our feet trembled with the pulse of massive engines below. The deeper we traveled, the more intense the vibrations became, as though we were walking across the ribs of a sleeping giant. We emerged from the shaft into a cavernous chamber lit by dim orange lumens. This was one of the primary recycling districts, a place where the Imperium's forgotten cast-offs were broken down, reprocessed, and made into something barely usable again. The air tasted of scorched plastic and corroded metal. Conveyor lines snaked through the chamber like metallic arteries, carrying heaps of scrap toward the grinders. But the grinders were silent. Everything was silent. Machines that should never stop even during emergencies sat dormant. The quiet was wrong, violent in its wrongness. Helvan scanned the shadows. Where is everyone? The mother clung tighter to her son. They should be working. There are always workers here. Always. She was right. The recycling districts were notorious for being among the most unforgiving areas in the entire sector. Miss a shift, and you vanished into the grinders, some whispered. Into the servitor vats, others said. No one took chances. So where were they now? We moved through the chamber cautiously, each step echoing far more loudly than it should. The gantries above creaked with faint drafts, as though something moved across them out of sight. The boy whimpered again. I hushed him, though I suspected the reassurance rang hollow. We found the first sign of human presence near one of the larger sorting belts, a half-eaten nutrient pack, its contents dried into a brittle crust. Beside it lay a discarded glove torn at the fingers, as though ripped off in haste. Then, a little farther on, a scattering of papers shift rosters, ration logs littered the floor, their edges curled and damp. No bodies, I murmured. Helvan nodded grimly. No workers, no overseers, no enforcers. Where did they all go? The mother whispered. No one answered. We continued on, weaving through the silent machinery until we reached an auxiliary corridor branching deeper into the facility. The walls there bore long scratches, deep enough to gouge metal. My stomach twisted as I brushed my fingertips over one. The metal was bent inward, as though struck with considerable force. Helvan saw my expression and shook his head quickly. Probably machinery failure, a loose claw arm, nothing more. But we both knew claw arms didn't move like that. They didn't swipe, they didn't drag. We walked faster after that, The corridor emptied into the hab service tunnels, dark, vascular pathways that fed warmth and water to residential blocks above. These tunnels were warmer, almost suffocatingly so. Steam vented in heavy bursts from ruptured pipes. The hum of the life support systems throbbed unevenly. Then we heard voices, faint, ragged. Ahead, Helvan raised a hand, signaling caution. We approached the sound carefully until the shapes of several figures emerged from the heat haze. Civilians, huddled against a wall, their faces gaunt and hollow. They looked at us with wild, glassy eyes. One man rose shakily to his feet. His clothes were torn, and his arm bore a long gash wrapped in filthy cloth. "Are you from Delta 9?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Yes," Helvan replied. "What happened here? Where are the workers?" The man's lips trembled. "Gone. They told us to evacuate. Everyone. They herded us down here, said we'd be safe. But then..." He broke off, shaking his head. "They sealed the main exits. They locked us in." A chill cut through me. "Why?" The man's gaze flicked toward the deeper tunnels, where the steam hung thickest. "Because something came up from the sump levels. Something they didn't understand. They said it was contamination. But contamination doesn't move fast. It doesn't scream." His voice cracked on the last word. The mother clutched her child tighter. "There are enforcers here? Administratum? Anyone?" "They left." The man slumped back against the wall. "Said they were containing. Said they would cleanse the lower levels before it spread. But they didn't come back. Contain, cleanse, purge. The Imperium had its rituals." Helvan's face darkened. "How long ago? Hours? Days? I don't know anymore." We shared a silent understanding. We couldn't stay here. Whatever had driven the enforcers to seal the exits might still be moving through the lower tunnels. Helvan stepped forward. "Is there another way out?" The man nodded weakly. "Through the coolant docks. They lead to the outer maintenance platforms. Dangerous, old, but not sealed." "Can you walk?" I asked. He hesitated, then nodded again. We helped the others gather themselves. A group of 9 joined us, including 2 who could barely stand. The mother shared what little water she had left with a child not her own. We moved as one, a fragile procession through the throbbing heat of the service tunnels. The air grew colder as we neared the coolant docks, the temperature dropping sharply with each step. Frost clung to the pipes here. Condensation froze on exposed skin. The docks were immense, a cathedral of steel catwalks suspended over vast coolant reservoirs shimmering with pale blue light. The air above them rippled with chemical chill. The docks were supposed to be crowded with technicians and servitors. Instead, they lay in dead, unmoving quiet. And there, near the far platform, lay drag marks. Long, heavy, irregular. My stomach clenched. Helvan motioned for silence and began guiding us across the catwalk. We moved carefully, each footstep sending small vibrations along the metal grid beneath us. Halfway across, a distant clatter echoed through the docks. Every muscle in my body locked. Something shifted in the shadows above the coolant reservoirs. Not machinery, not human. A heavy, wet sound followed, like something dragging itself across metal. The boy whimpered again. His mother covered his mouth gently. The sound came again, closer. We didn't wait to see what it was. We ran. The catwalk shook under our feet as the whole group surged toward the outer access door. The injured stumbled, but we caught them, dragging them forward. Behind us, something large and unseen scraped against steel, moving faster than anything that size should move. The door came into sight. Helvan threw his weight against the manual release lever. It resisted, groaning under years of rust, then snapped open with a scream of metal. We spilled into the outer maintenance platform, a vast ledge overlooking the lower hemisphere of the hive. Cold wind tore at our clothes. Below us stretched a chasm so deep it seemed to swallow light. We slammed the door shut and threw the locking bar across it just as something massive struck it from the other side, bending the steel inward. Screeches, inhuman, metallic, wet, rattled through the frame. The mother pressed her child to her chest, both shaking violently. The civilians huddled together, breath steaming in the pastern, frigid air. Helvan stood at the edge of the platform, hands braced on the railing, staring out at the endless vertical sprawl of the hive city. Towers climbed into darkness. Lights flickered in the far distance. Smoke drifted like shrouds from unseen vents. Somewhere above, alarms still wailed. "This is the Imperium," he whispered, almost to himself. "This is what we are to it." I stepped beside him. "What are we supposed to do now?" I asked. He turned to me, and in his tired eyes I saw no illusions, no comforting lies. "Survive." The door behind us buckled again. We moved away from it, guiding the others toward an emergency ladder that spiraled down along the hive's exterior. The mother went first, her child clinging to her shoulders. Helvan waited until last, listening to the screeching metal before beginning his descent. The wind howled, the hive groaned, the void hung vast and merciless around us. The Imperium had never promised mercy, it had only promised survival to those strong or lucky enough to claim it. As we climbed down into the darkness below, I realized something quietly, painfully clear. Civilians like us didn't live in the Imperium. We endured it, and somewhere within that endurance, fragile, trembling, defiant, was the only kind of future we were ever allowed to have.